Okay, good evening, everyone. I see we have about 5 people on right now, so I hope everybody's doing all right. Thank you for being here. At any time during the presentation, you can use the chat feature. There's a little chat button. If you have questions, I'll be sure to look and answer them for you. Let's see. Send a message real quick here. So hopefully you all saw that. This is going to be the first of two sessions we're going to do, same topic as you've probably heard. After this session tonight, by tomorrow, the recorded session will be available. So if you would like this sent to you, please email me and I will do so. So let's see, we have a lot to get through. We have a whole history of Chicana psychology to get through in an hour and a half. But I think we're going to hit some main points. I'm really excited about talking to you all on this topic. This has been a topic that has guided my work and my interest in the field forever, since I was in college. So ever since then, I've been working toward learning more about the history of Chicanic psychology, talking to people about it, giving presentations about it. And it informs a lot of the work that we do now. So I'm happy that there are other people interested, and please feel free to spread the word about the upcoming webinar on the 23rd. We can get as many people as possible watching and learning. That would be great. So about 1994, I think, for me, is when I was doing some research in college, and I was in the library, and I came upon a book that had the words Chicano psychology. I was a psych major. It was the first time I had seen those words together. And of course, I had never learned anything about this. I didn't know that there were these great individuals that we're going to talk about today out there, or the work that they had been doing. And unfortunately, it's still the same story today, right? Because in the 90s, when I discovered this book, I was surprised to see that it had been published in the 70s. And so it was already outdated. And when I saw that book, I think for me, it allowed me as a Chicano to realize that I could pursue a career in this field of psychology and mental health, and I could combine it with the history of my people and my identity, and I knew that there were other people before me that had already taken this struggle on. And that, for me, was the missing piece, because I knew I was interested in the field. But even then, of course, I could tell that the field was white dominated. It was a westernized perspective. My people's experiences were not included as they should have been. So I was already interested in the field, but had these struggles. And when I learned that people had already been doing this work, that was a turning point. So I offer that piece because it's an important piece of the presentation I'm giving, because for me now that is part of my history. So we're gonna let's see. Okay. One of the people we're going to talk about today, some of you may already know her by name, Dr. Marta Bernal from San Antonio, which is my hometown. And I was lucky enough to see one of her last keynote speeches in the late 90s, before she passed away in the early 2000s. This was one of her quotes that was later printed in one of the Chicano psychology books that we'll talk about. And it's always been an important piece because Dr. Bernal spent her career as a researcher looking at the way our people developed in terms of their identity and their cultural identity. So when she makes this statement, it's not just, which is also important, her experience and the experiences we have. This is a statement that comes from her decades of research, which is that, cultural identity, ethnic identity, and pride in who we are is an important piece for us to feel whole, for us to feel complete in who we are, and it guides what we want to do with our lives. Right? So I really love this quote. It's a great way to start out the presentation. I'll always encourage again anybody that has any questions along the way to feel free to put the questions in the chat box, and I will get to them. Okay, so I think those of us on here kind of understand this, but when I'm speaking to a wider variety of people, I think it's important that even for us culturally, history is important for our identity, and we'll talk more about that as I give more examples throughout the evening. But particularly, of course, for a group of people that have not been included in mainstream history, mainstream education, whose existence continues to be marginalized, and all the children in our society growing up in that reality, and that's the reality that we've been growing up in for years. So history, the past, is relevant in the present, particularly for us, because just like me, if I had not discovered that there had been people doing this work already, if I hadn't found that Chicano psychology book, then I would have gone on a path, maybe searching on my own for it, but reinventing the wheel, maybe not having those guides. Because when I went and looked back, those people that I found out about became my guides, and the work that they did became my guides. So where we were, where we are, and where we're going. And for us, all of our history, and especially the history of Chicano psychology or Chicanic psychology, it's about reclaiming our place, rediscovering, and recognizing that we have always had a role in shaping this field. And so I think that already is a foundation for the argument of why are we looking at the history of Chicano psychology. And I think it's important also because when we look at Chicano studies or Chicanic studies, Chicano psychology really hasn't had a place there, and it really should. And I think one of the reasons why it doesn't is connected to a larger problem, which is just kind of the idea of psychology and mental health has been stigmatized and is stigmatized in general. And what we need to realize is that a Chicanx psychology is not one that will stigmatize our people or ostracize them, but one that is responsive to our people and actually comes from the needs of our people. So I think that's an important piece. So we know a little bit about the Chicano movement, the civil rights movement, and that's important here because part of that movement and the people, the young people, young Chicanos that went ahead and were positively affected by that movement and went ahead and continued on, some of them with their formal education. Some of them went on to do history, political science, scientists. Some of them went on to be writers. And that's the formation and the construction of Chicano history, Chicanx history, right? Our history started to kind of be constructed in that era, through that era, because we had always had that history, of course, right? But that was a time when a lot of people got together, not for the first time, but most recently, and seemed to be the most impactful, and started organizing our history, putting it together, and creating Chicano studies programs, right? And some of those people went into psychology. We don't hear very much about those activists, but some of those activists became, mental health practitioners or psychologists, or maybe professors in psychology. And so, again, the constructing of the history of Chicana psychology also had a root, at least a strong root, from this era, right? And so, one of the things, of course, about that I'm already alluding to is that there really isn't one definition of Chicana psychology out there. And part of that is good, because we've never been part of the canon. We've never been part of the mainstream. And the good part about that is that when you are part of a canon, or like the main narrative, you become fully accepted into the mainstream education, then people have to really decide what you are and what you aren't. And so, on the one hand, Chicana psychology hasn't really been clearly defined, but on the other, it hasn't been, because it hasn't been pushed into the mainstream. And a benefit of that is that we've been able to construct it in the way we would like. So most people that talk about Chicana psychology and were at the root of the formation of constructing its history already had a social justice or an activist perspective, and really emphasized the notion of ethnic pride. And that's kind of the tradition that I'm talking about. From the first edition of the book, Chicano Psychology, 1977, there was one general framework offered about what is, at that time, they said, what is Chicano psychology? And there can be other definitions, but one of the reasons I include this is because the history is important, and this whole webinar is about looking at the documented history, right? So this was one of the first definitions offered in a book, in the first book that was called Chicano Psychology. And it's a pretty decent definition in the sense that it lays out some foundational pieces that make sense, recognizing the developmental, psychological, mental health needs of this population, just recognizing those needs, recognizing the influence of historical, social, and cultural factors in how these needs are expressed, right? And this is when you talk about different populations being misdiagnosed, overdiagnosed, underdiagnosed. That's because the radar of mainstream psychology doesn't recognize how certain populations express their needs, right? Or express their distress, or express their joy. And so that's what we mean by recognizing that our history and our social factors and our cultural factors are going to impact how we express our needs in the world, right? And it also recognizes that ethnicity influence human behavior, right? Who we are, our ethnic background, and all that means impacts how we look at the world, how we walk around in the world, how we interact with each other. So this is a very kind of foundational, and one of the first, as far as I know, definitions offered of Chicano psychology. We're welcome, of course, all of us, to revise the definition, to continue to evolve it. And I think every once in a while we need to do that, right? Of course. So some of the things, as I've said, that I'm going to talk about are some key aspects of this history. There's no way we can go through all of it, but I think we're going to get a really good idea of some key pieces, right? One of them is talking about some ancestral concepts and approaches to what we now would call mental health, right? And so those come from our indigenous populations in pre-conquest Mexico. Um, we're going to talk about some important events that started happening in the early 70s until now that have helped continue and keep alive Chicana psychology and more broadly, Latinx psychology. And we're going to hit on a few key people that have shaped the field as well, right? So there is also a little bit of history from the Spanish side, and one of the things that is important to note is that in the history of psychology and psychiatry, Spain was way ahead of its time in its knowledge and treatment of what we now call mental health issues. And I say that because the U.S. psychology narrative does dominate. And if you look at your basic psychology textbooks or your psychology 101 classes, we never start with some of the accomplishments that we're talking about here, right? Particularly from Spain. In 1913, in a publication of the Psychological Review, which is a psychological journal, which is still in publication today, it was claimed that the father of modern psychology was Juan Luis Vives. And this article, this is just an image of the first page of that article, talks about why this author makes that claim. And that's significant, of course, because the mainstream narrative is that Sigmund Freud is the founder, right, the father. But Juan Luis Vives, if we look back at his work, he did pioneer a lot of current practices that we use today that are still seen as valid and important. And he was able to find that there were different ways to approach and treat people that were struggling with mental health issues. Before then, unfortunately, it was usually just a brute response. People were locked in institutions and prisons. They were locked away. They were treated inhumanely. But Juan Luis Vives was one of the first to document that, depending on the needs, the treatment needed to be different. Some people really needed more intensive medical care, right? Some people needed more gentle care, right? More support. We might interpret that as the evolution of what became counseling or therapy. And some people needed instruction. And that's also just psychoeducational information, just information about their own development and developmental processes. So it's important to, I think, recognize that piece as well. So when the Spanish came to what is now Mexico, and they encountered the Aztecs, the Aztec Empire, one of the things that is documented but is not talked about as often is that they were surprised at the system of medical care that they found with these indigenous peoples. They wrote about how their system of medicine and care, was beyond what they had in Europe. And there's even a documented letter where Cortés wrote to Spain and said, "Don't send any more doctors or surgeons because those here are far superior than any that we have in Europe." So these were people that understood wellness. They understood how to treat the body, the mind. They understood what was required for healthy development of society, right? And so again, we need to continue to have that conversation when we talk about like we're in, Latinx Heritage Month or Raza Heritage Month or Hispanic Heritage Month. Always in any opportunity, but right now when we're talking about our heritage, we need to remember that we come from a heritage of wellness and strength, and that the reason why we don't really have that image of ourselves or have that access to that knowledge is because that line was broken, that line was shattered in the conquest, right, and in the subsequent colonization of our peoples. So no one's going to bring this knowledge back for us. If we know this, then we're the ones that must continue to bring this forward, to talk about it, to learn more about it. One of the interesting things is that the Aztec peoples or the Mexica peoples, it seems like what they did is they divided mental illness or mental health into two categories: passive and active, right? And that is something that in the way we look at it today still makes sense, right? Because active mental illness is now what we would be calling maybe addiction or substance abuse, right? Where someone was displaying addictive behaviors with certain plants and fungi. And so the treatment, the recommendation, a lot of the times were antitoxins, right? And withdrawal procedures, very similar to things that we still do today. And from the writings that we see, of course, a lot of these indigenous healers, we can pretty safely say, treated conditions that very much resembled what we now call schizophrenia, depression, anxiety. There were a particular group of people, the Tonalpauqui, that Dr. Amado Padilla, who looked at some of this research when he put it together from the documents he reviewed, argued that would be very equivalent to what we would see today as somebody that would be trained to diagnose and work with, cure mental health issues and struggles, right? The Tonalpauqui, there's not too much written, but they were also seen as soothsayers, interpreters of dreams. They also were responsible for the naming of children and trying to find the correct names that signified when the child was born, and so they did that with the parents, and that's usually what people know of them. But Dr. Padilla, Amado Padilla, in the early 80s went through those documents and reviewed them, and I guess he was looking at this through the eyes of a psychologist. And so in looking at the actions and the behaviors that the Tonalpauqui did, he could see them as probably an equivalent to what we would call a psychologist or mental health provider today, right? A lot of the times they wrote about what we would call psychotherapy today, And as I said, dream interpretation is one piece, but also ego formation, which is the development of the self, the development of identity. Um, and like a lot of pupils, of course, at that time, this is not anything different. Um, at those at certain times, and sometimes even currently, mental illness had larger explanations beyond just physiological. Some people believe that there were some spiritual aspects involved in mental illness. Or when we say punishment for sinful behavior, it's more in the lines of that would be the way it would have been described. Um, in a certain framework, but this is kind of looking at when things are out of balance, and when things become restored, when the balance becomes restored, um, sometimes that can have what we would consider a negative effect on somebody, and we can talk a little bit more about that later on. So the concept of mental illness or psychopathology, those are some words that we don't really employ as much anymore, and I know we don't really use those in our work. But also, I'm trying to kind of be true to some of the writings and in the writings that in the descriptions that people had of outlining this history. So, but when there were mental health struggles, the Mexica or the Aztec perspective was that there were three components. There was always a social component, what we would call psychological component, and a physiological component. And each of these had to be attended to. From a social perspective, a person was having difficulty, and that difficulty was going to not just impact that person, but it was going to be an impact on the community, right? Because it was going to mess with the balance, the rhythm, the equilibrium of the community which they were part of. So that means that oftentimes there was always a role for the community in helping that person get back to a place of health, right? And so we see that today, in a lot of worldwide and a lot of indigenous peoples' traditions and cultures. We see that in a lot of societies that are more collectivistic rather than individualistic. There was a book written some years ago, I don't remember the title, a psychotherapist, Jeffrey Kotler, was one of the co-authors. And what him and his colleague did is they went to different societies in the world and spent a little bit of time with some different indigenous healers. And one of the things that he talks about is that they got often was how surprised some of the healers were when Kotler would explain to them the way we do psychotherapy or counseling, because it was so individualistic. They would get questions like, well, where's the fire? There's no fire in your healing. Where's the drumming? Where's the dancing? Where are the people? And it's such a juxtaposition to seeing that and trying to picture that healing, and then looking at the way most counseling is done now, where you're in a room with one other person, pretty isolated, pretty quiet. And I think that is the picture that a lot of the indigenous healers were getting, and you can see what a stark contrast that is from their notions of healing. What needs to happen for someone to get back into their wellness, right? So, let's see. What's considered the psychological element, right? That piece resembles, what we would consider maybe current day counseling. The Tonolpauqui was believed that they had a certain authority, certain knowledge, to assist people through lengthy conversations, right? And these lengthy conversations would help liberate what was ailing the person, whether it was spiritual or what have you. But the process was through talk, through conversation, which is why one of the things that I've been talking about over the last year and a half and some of the other work we're doing, and it's just really a way of looking at things. It's a framework, is that if you really think about it, the idea and the notion of therapy is ours. Therapy is ours. It's not only ours, anyone can do it, but our ancestors have always gone to their elders, to their circle, to talk about what's difficult. We have always known that talking is healing. So why is it so stigmatized in our culture today? Why do we have those notions of not reaching out and not talking through things? That's a product of colonization. That is something that we've been tricked into believing is part of our culture, but is not really part of our culture of origin. Our culture of origin has always known that talking is healing. And so, and part of that colonization and that marginalization is that the owners of the mental health field have always been people that have had negative perceptions of our people, have not been culturally responsive. And so, the legitimate piece of that is that when our people go seek help, a lot of times it's going to be from someone who doesn't understand our perspectives, our culture, our way of being, our families. And so we've been burned, right? And we have definitely had some scars. So that part is real, right? But just the notion, I think, that is also true, again, is that the idea of going to people when we're having a hard time is rooted in our history, right? And so I think that's something that we need to always remember. Another piece of why the Tonalpauki were seen to be successful is not always the techniques, if you want to say, that they used, or we would say today the theory that they used, but it was who they were, their personal characteristics, right? And actually, for those of you that follow the psychotherapy research, that's actually what the quote unquote, like the empirical research has bared out, is that it's the relationship that makes therapy successful. It's the person and their ability to connect with the person that's seeking help from them. That's the main factor. That's the primary factor in terms of that interaction, right? The physiological piece was the idea that the heart was the organ responsible for emotion and behavioral functioning. And, we see that in our life today. The heart represents emotion. It represents, or we refer to the heart as where our love comes from, our connection. And that idea has always stayed with us in popular culture. But I think it's important to note that that they really believed that it was the actual organ of the heart that was responsible for that. And so where, people would say you're having mental problems, in these days, they might say you're having heart problems. It's your issue with the heart. That is what we need to look at, right, to get to the healing piece. Right? So those were just pieces of what we've been able to gather, and primarily This review is primarily a result of Dr. Amado Padilla, um, and him piecing this together from what was out there, because we know that the majority of the writings um, and the knowledge um, of our ancestors was lost and destroyed in the conquest, right? And in the ensuing years after. So we don't have very much, but even the information that we've had is invaluable, right? I think we can agree that this is information that we need to continue to share with each other, with our colleagues, with our peers. This needs to always be a part of our discussions when we're talking about Chicana psychology, and when we're talking about, you know, um, Raza Heritage Month, for example, as one example. This is part of our historic contributions. Um, okay. Hope everyone's doing okay out there. Um, Dr. George Sanchez. I'm in Austin, Texas. So in Austin, a lot of people actually now know his name because the building that houses the College of Education at University of Texas here is named the George Sanchez Building, um, and that was very significant, really very important to have this person recognized in this way here. Um, he was a contributor in the education of Chicano children, and that again has been primarily what he's known for, even here at the University of Texas. And so, but what a lot of people don't realize still, psychology kind of gets put aside. I think people don't know what to do with us, or psychology scares them. I'm not sure, but he was actually a psychologist, educational psychologist, researcher, and so for Chicano psychologists, in 1977, when that first edition was put together, there was an appreciation of Dr. George Sanchez, a small piece written at the beginning of the book, recognizing him as what they call the father of Chicano psychology. He was the first Chicano to write about anything in regards to the well-being of Chicanos, Mexican Americans, in terms of their mental health, or from a psychological perspective. He was also an advocate for civil rights and for social justice. Although he got his doctorate at Berkeley, he did spend most of his career here at UT. Four of his earliest contributions are still, when they're reviewed today, they still hold up. They're still relevant. They're somewhat of a landmark in the notion of intelligence testing. He was the first person to write about the cultural bias in intelligence testing. And you would think that he had never written these pieces because we're still fighting a lot of those battles. In 1932, one of the first of those four articles, which are still available if you have access to is it called Psych Articles, database, university database. You should be able to find these articles. So the first of these four, 1932, really took a strong stance against the idea that children who spoke Spanish were inherently intellectually inferior to children who spoke English, based on the IQ scores they were receiving. He was the first person that seriously questioned the notion, the interpretation that heredity was the primary reason for IQ differences. Right? In 1934, he strongly criticized the misuse of IQ testing and mental health testing. People just ignored that language and culture were factors in the results. And so he was one of the first that said, an instrument is only as good as its ability to measure what it says it's supposed to be measuring in relation to the population who's taking the tests. So all of these arguments that we hear about today that people are still working on, he beautifully outlined in those first 4 articles. The research is phenomenal. It's solid. It's a touchstone. And it's part of our history. It's part of our history and our contributions because of Dr. Sanchez. He was one of the first people that started actively promoting bilingual education, bicultural education. He spoke out publicly and in academic circles about the segregation of Chicano children. That's another thing, of course, I think that us here in this webinar probably know, but it's one of the things that I always try to bring up every once in a while is that even people in the Southwest and here in Texas, don't realize that Chicano children, Mexican American children were also segregated. We had segregated schooling, and so he was one of those that spoke out against that. An interesting piece of his career is that he also gave testimony, I believe, in the Zoot Suit riots, for those of you that know what that is, in California. And his testimony was so strong that he cited society's role as an accessory before and after the fact of the riots. In other words, arguing against the prejudicial attitudes and discriminatory actions that wanted to villainize the Mexican Americans, the Pachucos, in the Zoot Suit riots, right? And so he has that piece also in beginning to talk about and acknowledging that it was society's roles and society's attitudes that were marginalizing these youth. He also was one of the most influential people in creating the foundation of what became and what is now Head Start programs and many bilingual, bicultural programs. So Dr. Sanchez left a pretty significant legacy, and if you ever get a chance to look at his work, I know that you'll be impressed. Dr. Martha Bernal, also an important trailblazer. She was the first known Chicana in the U.S. to earn a doctorate in psychology. And that's, not the only reason why she's noted. Her research really became the template and continues to this day. She was really the first in psychology to begin to look at the way we develop what's now called ethnic identity, right? Our ethnic identity, how we come to know ourselves as Chicanos, as Mexican Americans. And she continues to be recognized for her roles in that area. And the notion of identity development and Chicanx identity development is the most researched area in the field of Chicanic psychology. It has been since the 70s up until now. We talk, there are a lot of different areas. Second behind that is probably acculturation, and then family, spirituality, a lot of the core elements. But Chicanx identity development is the most researched area, and she's part of that beginning. She was recognized as a pioneer, senior woman of color in 1999. And she also in the late 70s was a founding member and was very responsible for beginning the first association of Hispanic psychologists, the National Hispanic Psychological Association. That particular association did not last through the 80s, but as we'll talk about in a little while, it was resuscitated, and we'll talk about kind of its current formation right now, how it looks right now. But one of the things that I remember about Dr. Bernal is when I got to see her speak in the late 1990s. And she's documented this as well. And, you can find this in maybe her biographies or her tributes and some of her writings. But I was able to hear her talk about that, her experiences as a woman of color, as a Chicana in psychology, as a graduate student, being chased around by other male professors, sexually harassed. And also, what stood out was she talked about attending one of the first conferences, first symposiums on Chicano psychology in the 70s. And she said, I wasn't surprised that there were other Mexican-American, Chicano psychologists there, Chicanos there, because of course that was the purpose of the conference. There weren't many of us, but I wasn't surprised that there were other brown faces. She said, what did surprise me was attending the sessions and hearing the research and the work that was being done. And she was surprised, she said, at the high quality of research that was being done. And then she said that was her wake-up call, because when she felt that surprise, wow, these people are top-notch. This research is excellent. She started questioning why she was so surprised about that. And she realized that she had been living still, even though she was proud of who she was attending this, she wanted to be part of this association, that she had some deep-seated internalized oppression, internalized racism, that why would it surprise her that her other colleagues be such great researchers? And she was very ashamed, and it was a very difficult realization for her. But it was that was a turning point in her career. That is what led her into her career of studying ethnic identity development for Mexican-American children and other Latino children and other minority children, ethnic minority children. So that, and always working toward ways and pathways for Latinas to get a graduate education. Those were two of the things that really were her main causes. But that was a powerful story to hear her. You can read about it, but to hear her tell that story. And I think some of that holds true for a lot of us today. I still hear stories of therapists, Latino therapists, Chicano therapists, where the client comes in, same ethnicity, right? And the client gets upset because they see another brown face, and they're upset because they'll say things like, well, how come I'm not getting the real doctor? How come I'm not getting the real counselor? Right? So we still struggle with those issues of internalized racism and oppression and internalized oppression. So um, the National Hispanic Psychological Association that she helped start evolved into what is now it's the National Latinx Psychological Association. And she was instrumental in securing that. And one of her most cited books is an edited book with her colleagues called Ethnic Identity, Formation, Transmission Among Hispanics and Other Ethnic Minorities. And this is a classic book in ethnic identity development. She continued to write in this area on this topic, of course. And I think people trying to understand how we get a sense of our cultural pride and our cultural identity have to start with Dr. Bernard and some of her work. We're going to touch on a few more people, and then we'll start taking some questions. We have some other areas to talk about, but we could. This could be a 3 to 5 hour presentation if we needed it to be. So Dr. Ramirez, who's now semi-retired or phased retirement, spent most of his career here at UT Austin. As a graduate student, he was one of the first people that started getting other Chicano psychologists together at conferences, helped develop some of the first gatherings, and in the early 70s, he worked with Dr. Castañeda, who is affectionately known as El Profe by a lot of the Chicano psychologists and students during that time. And so the very first gathering at all of a group of Chicano psychologists was just a symposium panel at one of the 1971 conference of the American Psychological Association. Right? It was the first time there was a group of Chicano psychologists presenting. And so he was a panelist in that, and he helped co-organize the subsequent gathering, small initial gathering of Chicano psychologists, titled Increasing Educational Opportunities for Chicanos in Psychology. Those pieces led to further gatherings, which we'll talk about. But a couple of key pieces of Dr. Ramirez is in 1974, he co-authored the Cultural Democracy by Cognitive Development and Education. It is a groundbreaking book in what became multicultural education. And then in 1983, he wrote Psychology of the Americas. And this is where he proposes that our worldview, as what he says is mestizos, basically as people of the conquest, right? Because of that, our worldview, our perspective, our personality development is distinct. And he laid out those tenets, which we'll touch on at the end of the webinar, that have evolved. And this was also an incredibly groundbreaking work. If you read anything that Dr. Ramirez writes, he's never shy about being critical and criticizing mainstream and Western ideas of psychology. Dr. Vasquez was one of the first also people as a student, as a graduate student, who attended some of those first gatherings, excuse me, and later became instrumental and um, helping further the representation of ethnic minorities in psychology in the American Psychological Association. She helped co-found some of the organizations you see listed there. And in 2011, she was historic in becoming the first Latina to be elected president of the American Psychological Association. There is a YouTube link there that unfortunately we don't have time to look at, but it's her being interviewed, and you can probably look up Melba Vasquez on YouTube, and she's being interviewed by Dr. Cynthia de las Fuentes, a colleague of hers. And she talks a little bit about some of those first gatherings of Chicano psychologists. And she has always been a social justice advocate. She comes from a family of social justice advocates. And she has cleared the path for a lot of work around cultural responsiveness, and ethnic minority issues to be received and respected in the larger psychological field. Another person I think that, excuse me, we would consider maybe more recent in the development of Chicana psychology, but definitely important to include, is Dr. Patricia Redondo. She was the first Latina to be president of the American Counseling Association, which is very similar to the American Psychological Association. She was also the founding president of the National Latinx Psychological Association. She helped to resuscitate and revamp and resurrect what was the National Hispanic Psychological Association from the 70s. And now the NLPA, after that renewal, has continued to grow and is still growing strong and moving forward today. She was also recently the president of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. The American Psychological Association has named her a living legend for her work in developing multicultural competencies in counseling. And very recently, she was recognized by the American Psychological Association as one of the top 25 women psychologists of color. Any of these people you can look up and get a lot more information about their accomplishments and who they are and why we're recognizing them tonight. Excuse me. Sorry about my throat. So in 1973, that gathering outside of its own, that independent gathering, because you had the first symposium at the APA conference, but the first gathering outside of that was a small gathering in 1973, co-organized by Dr. Ramirez and Castañeda. And that built up to the first symposium or conference on Chicano psychology at UC Irvine in 1976. The proceedings of a lot of those presentations and the research presented there was compiled and then published in the book that I told you about. This was the book that I saw in my college library. This is the book that was the first book ever to have those two words together in the same title, Chicano and psychology. The first time those two words were in a book titled together. And that was published in 1977. In 1979, Dr. Padilla founded and established, became the editor, and I believe still is the editor of the Hispanic Journal of Behavioral Sciences. That was the first journal in the field of the social sciences, behavioral sciences, that focused on the Latinx population, and it's still alive and strong today. After the first symposium of Chicano psychology in 1982, there was the second symposium that was 6 years later at UC Riverside. And at that symposium, again, they gathered some of the research presentations, and they were able to publish the second edition of the book Chicano Psychology that came out in 1984. In that book, one of the first chapters there is Dr. Padilla's synopsis of the history of, I think he calls it Hispanic psychology. Or no, he says Chicano psychology. It's on the, and a lot of the key pieces that I've reviewed come from the work that Dr. Padilla did in outlining that history. Another person that's done that is Dr. Ramirez. He's also been one that has been a steward of noting the conferences, the gatherings, the key pieces in this history. So then we had a 16-year absence. Chicano psychology wasn't around anymore. It seemed like people weren't gathering. There was no consistency. It was the 80s also, which was also a very socially conservative era. A lot of ethnic minority psychologists and gatherings weren't seen as a priority. But after 16 years from the last one, in 1998, there was what's considered the third conference of Chicano psychologists at Michigan State. And this conference was primarily fueled by graduate students, Chicano graduate students, that were learning about this history and said, hey, it's time to put another conference on, and contacted a few Chicano psychologists they knew, got Michigan State University to host it. And that was the conference that I attended as a graduate student. That's where I heard Dr. Martha Bernal speak. That's where I was able to meet a lot of the people that I've just been talking to you about that showed up at that third conference there. And that also was there was also a key feature of that conference where there was a panel discussion. The theme of the conference was innovations in Chicano psychology, and the panel had a lot of these trailblazers. We didn't get to talk too much about Dr. Manuel Casas, who also has a place, but this was a historic panel as well that occurred. Since that gathering in Michigan State University in 1998, we have now been consistent in meeting at least every 2 years. There was a conference held in San Antonio in 2000, organized primarily by Dr. Cynthia de las Fuentes, again, colleague of Dr. Mabel Vasquez. And I think I believe it was just titled Latino Psychology. The following year in Rhode Island began the planning for the resurgence of the National Latino Psychology Association, Latinx Psychological Association. And then since then, there have been conferences every 2 years. But still, during those times, it was difficult if you were a student of psychology or psychologist to try to find a focus on people of Mexican descent in the field and some of their issues and some of the research. The Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development, JMCD, in 1997 put out a special issue that focused solely on Chicanx, on the Chicanx population. It's the first time they did that, I believe, and I don't believe they've done it since. But it was a key issue. The only other journal in 2001 called The Counseling Psychologist was the only other journal, scholarly journal, academic journal, that also focused primarily, they had an issue that focused on the Chicanx population. And in 2013, we had Dr. Yvette Flores out in California put together a nice updated book on Chicana and Chicano mental health. Right, this was the only book since 2004 that had been published with a focus on the Chicanx population. Right, but luckily, The NLPA, the National Latinx Psychological Association, was able to work with the American Psychological Association to finally get a journal that still exists today, still going strong, a journal that focuses on the Latinx population, Journal of Latinx Psychology. So this is at least one resource that we can go to that has some important information and current research on what's happening. If anyone has any comments or questions, please let me know throughout. We got about 15 minutes, and then I think I'll pause at that point and also see if anyone has any questions or comments. So, in that 1983 book, Psychology of the Americas by Dr. Ramirez, he laid out tenets of a mestizo worldview, right? And he revised that in 2004 for the book, the Handbook of Chicana Psychology. But each of these tenets that I'm going to touch on, we could spend the whole presentation just reviewing these tenets. But the thing that's important is that we note that what he's trying to say here in each of these as we go through them is that because of our experiences, again, starting with the conquest and the continuing marginalization and colonization, that our way of looking at the world is going to be distinct in some ways. And we need to understand that for ourselves, and the field needs to understand that as well. So one of the things that he pointed out, which I think is now gaining some legitimacy throughout society, is that people are affected by their environment and their environment affects them. We're not a closed system. And by closed system, I mean that whatever's wrong with me doesn't just come from in here all the time. Sometimes that happens, where that's where we can locate what's wrong with us. So if we're having some difficulties, some emotional struggles, looking at someone as a closed system means that we have to look inside the person and see what's wrong with their thinking, what's wrong with what's misfiring, right? What's happening. But that is counter to what Ramirez is saying, is that even if that's where we see the issues arising, the people are always an open system. If we are just looking within them, then we're missing half of what's happening. We need to realize that people are inseparable from their environments. The notion of spirituality, either in a larger sense or a more specified religiosity, either way, like in that continuum, the idea of a spiritual world is often very key to a lot of our people, and historically has been very key to understanding the world that we live in. Looking to elders, looking to people for guidance, believing that there's a connection to a world larger than ours, a spiritual world, and that also can offer some protection for the difficulties that we face in life. The notion that having a community identity and the notion that having a responsibility to the group is central in the personality development of a lot of our people. That is different than looking at, for some of you that know, for example, Erik Erikson, Stages of Development. Any type of developmental psychology book, any type of individual identity development, mainstream, always looks at and follows the development of the individual. Right? But what Ramirez is saying is that the development of the individual can't be understood without not looking at how the individual feels a responsibility or a connection to their group, their inner group, right? Whether it's their family, their extended family, or their community. Right? That's why traditions and rituals a lot of the times can be very important. One of the things I always say is this one you definitely never see in your Psychology 101 textbook as a key foundational piece of healthy psychological development. But for Ramirez and his argument that people of the Americas have, because of what we've experienced, he believes that the foundation of a good adjustment, to life or mental health is liberation, justice, freedom, and empowerment. I would tend to agree with that. Those are typically not seen, within the realm of psychology. He also noted that the development of our abilities lies a lot of the times in the way we challenge ourselves, our self-challenge to move through the world, right? So that the sum total of a person in their experiences with life involves not just who we are, but our social environment, our social context, our environment, our personality, and that all of those pieces are areas that are key in how we see the world, right? He also believes that there's always a search for us, and there's always a search for self-knowledge. There's always a search for our identity and our purpose in this world, our purpose in our life. And because of that, because there's always this search and because circumstances changes, he believes that the idea of the self is not as constant as it is explained in more mainstream psychology, that it's more in motion, right? It's always changing. And then we have the idea of duality in the universe and the origin of all life, right? Within education, within relationships, that idea of duality is an important piece in terms of keeping balance. So one of the concepts we see a lot in some of the indigenous peoples is the notion of the ometeo, right? The ometeo, which is, again, that duality, that we need that balance of two energies. We need both energies at play, the light and the dark. And it's when those energies are not in balance within ourselves or within our community, within our lives, that things become difficult, and we need to find a way to move those back in balance. So those are kind of some of the tenets that were important and I think demonstrate why we need to understand these more fully, continue to have these discussions to see how Chicanic psychology continues to be relevant for our people today. Looking at how we walk through the world and what influences us, our ideas of wholeness, our ideas of wellness and balance. Another piece that I wanted to touch on with you is the teaching of Chicanic psychology. This is a course. Well, if we're thinking about it as a course, it has been and is currently taught as a college course, a graduate course as well. And since the 1970s, there have always been several universities somewhere in the country teaching a Chicanic psychology course. Is it always well known? Nope, unfortunately. Is Chicanic psychology always part of Chicanic studies majors? Usually not, unfortunately. But people have always, there have always been people that have continued with this tradition. I've taught the course several times as well. And so I'd like to share with you, I think, some components that are important. Um, it's not, the end all and be all. There's definitely room for discussion, and I would love to hear your thoughts, if not today, via email. Um, um, and it's been a while since I've taught this course, so probably if I really looked at it, some of my ideas have evolved as well. But one of the things that I think is crucial is always starting with history, right? This webinar, a lot of it could be, a session, a first couple of sessions, right? And sometimes when we're talking about history, I would include general Chicana history, civil rights movement, peace, even before that. Um, so history is just such an important piece for our people. And I think we don't have time to talk about this, but part of it is we often see time as circular rather than linear. And ignoring history ignores the roots from which we've grown. And so history is crucial. And talking, of course, about some of our indigenous healing and methods and recommendations is always a piece of that. The other two components are acculturation and ethnic identity. They're different, but they're related, of course. We need to talk about how we come to know ourselves in terms of ethnic identity, how we come to see ourselves culturally, whether or not our families, our people, our community understand or use terms like Chicanx or Latinx or Hispanic even, or Mexican American. Even if those terms don't connect, we still need to know how we gather a sense of self culturally, how that identity develops. Because on a very basic level, if you don't have a sense of who you are, that is not a recipe for balance. It's not a recipe for wellness. People need to have a sense of themselves, of their self, their identity, their development. And so culture is a piece of that. Their cultural self is a piece of that identity, right? We need to look at family functioning, family roles, the familia, stereotypes, and again, family functioning, because we need to look at how our families don't always fit the mainstream concept of what a healthy family is. Our ways of interacting are going to be different. Our ways of healthy development, of interdependence, as opposed to the pathologized view of dependency. We need to be able to explain that, understand that, talk through that. We need to recognize that our families do have some unhealthy patterns as well a lot of the times, but we need to remember that those do not stem from our culture. They stem from the oppression that we have faced, from the marginalization that we have faced, from the exclusion that we have faced, from our ability not to have access to our own historic and ancestral ways of coping, and not having the access to current methods of coping, which may also be great to learn as well. But our difficulties are not rooted from the origins of our culture, the difficulties we have in our family. We have to recognize the unhealthiness, but we also have to recognize that a lot of what we've learned and what we say, not talking outside the family, or a lot of notions that we don't have time to get into, complex notions of machismo and patriarchy, that while there are elements of that in all cultures, I mean, all westernized cultures are patriarchal, but that even we believe that is part of our culture of origin. and it has become part of our culture, but in some ways, but it's become infused and part of our culture um, because of colonization, because of prejudice, because of people not recognizing what our families contribute. Right? There's a lot of aspects to that, but that's always an important piece. Um, we do need to look at the role of education, psychosocial issues in education. A lot of these pieces, the way our families operate, how we become proud of who we are or not proud of who we are, a lot of that takes place within schools, within the schools that we send our children to. So, how is education structured? How is it reflective? How is it responsive to us, to our people, to our culture? So there's a piece of that. And, there's some of us, know that there are different disciplines in psychology, right? Psychology itself, the modern psychology is not just psychotherapy or mental health, right? There's educational psychology, where a lot of this research comes from, cognitive psychology, right? Social psychology. Then there's clinical and counseling psychology. So the notion of there's a whole field, educational psychology, that looks at the impact of how to best educate people in a healthy way, is important for us to explore from a Chicanx perspective. Gender roles, of course, that's always key in us understanding ourselves and our development. LGBTQ identities as well need to be covered. And spirituality and indigenous healing, those two don't necessarily, they don't mean the same thing necessarily. But there's always a piece of, there's always a role a lot of the times in the functioning of our spiritual lives. And we need to look at how historically and currently our people still utilize indigenous healing or a syncretic form, curanderismo, or folk healing, because that has a role in Chicanic psychology. For Chicanic psychology to be Chicanic psychology, it can't just replicate the mainstream psychology field and just focus on a particular population. That it has to be Chicanic psychology has to be different in and of itself. It has to utilize what's important, but our worldview has to be different. What we incorporate has to be different, has to be responsive to who we are as people. And then we need to spend some time looking at some of the clinical issues, the quote unquote clinical issues that come up. And I put here general counseling approaches, but really just approaches to wellness. Some of them may be considered counseling approaches. Some of them may look more multidisciplinary. But either way, the idea is, how do we reach our people? How do we make connections to our people where they are at, right? A lot of the times when I talk about Chicanx psychology, I like to think of it as what I would say gente psychology. It has to come from the people. It can't just be top down, right? We have to be able to think and respond in ways that make sense for the populations, for our population, in thinking about what we would consider Chicanx psychology. Right? So I really wish I could cover more with you all. If you have any questions about anything I've covered, the conversation always continues. If you'd like it, I'm available via email. I'm available for questions. Um, I'm always happy to share this information. If anybody has any questions right now at the moment, please let me know. Yep, Alex, walk out to make sure. Yes, thank you, Monica. Thank you, Juliana. Um, I'm reading through some comments right now. Um, yeah, hall in which also majority Chicanics, and this is not taught. Stephanie, I know that's that's one of the institutions where I did teach this course, and I don't think it's been taught since I've left. Um, you know, one of the participants, Stephanie, talks about this notion. This is also one of the things in terms of education and higher education that is different for a lot of our people, because we have historically black colleges, right? And they have a history of their cultural identity being rooted in that education. Unfortunately, there were historically black colleges because of segregation, right? Um, and so now we've had for a long time Hispanic serving institutions, but that's a government designation where you serve at least 25% of your population or student body is Hispanic, so you get federal funds, which is all great and fine. But that designation of Hispanic serving institution does nothing. It doesn't um, require or reach out to, or it has nothing to do with that institution fostering a sense of identity or a sense of responsibility or a culture that is responsive to Latinx students or Chicanic students. And so anytime you hear the word Hispanic serving institution, I think it's important that all of us probably here, we know this already, remember that, because uh, it really doesn't say very much except that it serves a certain proportion of the student body, but that institution really probably doesn't have a cultural identity. Um, and what I mean is through curriculum, right? Through classes, through majors, through responsiveness of traditions, right? So stay with me, guys, for just a little while longer. Yes, traditions and rituals are sacred to our people. Thank you, Juliana. I like that. Uh, Liberation from internalized racism. Yeah, that's definitely a piece of it. Um, American Counseling Association, including an association for Spanish speaking therapists. That would be fantastic. That would be excellent. Yeah, she was. Um, Thank you all for writing some of these comments. Yes, trilingual is true. Yep. Oh, y'all, yeah, we're really writing some good things here. All right. Perfect. No quotes for Dr. Martha Bernal online. Got it worked. Oh no, there's no quote. You didn't find any quotes for Dr. Martha Bernal online. We need posters of the ancestors. Yeah, we do, Monica. That would be great. Are traditional healers and our curanderos invited to be part of the teaching team? They could be. They should be. They should definitely be part of that. Um, the best place to find some theoretical foundation ish of Chicanic psychology is it might be in dissertations that you look at, true, but the 2004 publication titled "The Handbook of Chicano Psychology and Mental Health" is probably the closest. It's an edited volume. You see a lot of the people that I talked about there. Um, it's probably the closest place I think that you would find some theoretical foundations. Um, it hasn't really been solidified. And so, again, for me, my bias, the great part about that is that if there's going to be a mounting dominant narrative of what Chicana psychology should be, it should definitely include being focusing on decolonization and social justice, because both of those things are not necessarily part of any mainstream psychological perspective. Right? Oh yeah, Cultura y Bienestar. I do have that book. I think that book is an important piece. It's definitely different than mainstream academic books, and I think that was their intention. Um, I went to school with Isaac, who writes one of the chapters here at Our Lady of the Lake in San Antonio, not here in Austin. And I think that book goes a little bit farther in offering the good thing about the book is it offers what those practitioners are actually doing with the community. So I think that's an important piece. Um, and I think I think we need more books like that. We need to fill in the gaps a little bit more. But I do think that's an important piece. Um, in that book, in that book, 2004, the Handbook of Chicano Psychology and Mental Health, the last chapter or piece, the epilogue of that book, is the written transcript of Dr. Martha Bernal's keynote, the one I attended from the 1998 conference in Michigan State. So that's one of the reasons why I highlighted some of these books, a few of them, because some of the information they captured, these conferences and these few books that are out there, um, you can tell that the people that put those volumes together also held our history very sacred. You know, like they understood that this was one of the few chances to capture a chapter or capture um, a piece of some of these trailblazing people. And so I would recommend that book, um, the 2004 book, because it helps outline some of this history. I also, of course, would recommend the first and second editions of Chicano Psychology. I believe you can find them on Amazon, I think. But those are key pieces to this history. So we know the foundation that we're standing on. Thank you all very much. I really, really appreciate you being here. I'm really happy that you were here. Please, like I said, don't hesitate to follow up with any questions. Um, Anything I can help you with, any way I can be supportive. Um, Juliana, your dissertation looks great. It's a great, interesting, missing component that we don't see too much about. So if there's any way that I can be supportive to any of you all, please let me know. And thanks, Sierra. Oh yeah, Julian and Sierra. Hey, glad you all guys were on. Um, I'm going to be on again on the 23rd. It's going to be same topic, same PowerPoint. But if you have people that maybe want to see it live, for sure, let them know. Anyone wants a recorded copy of this presentation, let me know. I'll email you the link. Instead of deconcentrating, the ontological development may be a better term. Yeah, I like that, Monica. That makes sense. Okay. Um, Thanks for staying with me. I appreciate it. Have a great, wonderful evening. We'll continue to try to have webinars, similar webinars of this kind. And I wish all of you the very best. I wish you the best in your journeys and what you're doing. Whatever brought you to this webinar, I hope it helps you continue on the path where you're going. And again, if there's anything I can do, please let me know. I'm gonna sign off. I'll talk to y'all soon if we keep in touch. Have a great evening. Take care.